Welcome, dear listeners, from wherever you are joining us tonight. Before we begin, tell me, where are you tuning in from?
Tonight, we step into the hidden corridors of history, into stories preserved in silence and ink.
Forget everything you thought you knew about Mount Olympus, because the stories they told you in school were a magnificent lie. A carefully constructed PR campaign spanning millennia, designed to hide a truth so volatile it could crack the very foundation of reality. We are not talking about marble statues and peaceful temples. We are peeling back the veil on the most dysfunctional, violent, and sexually predatory crime family that ever ruled a universe. And tonight, we are exposing what the Olympian gods were really like. Prepare yourself, because this is not mythology. This is the classified file on cosmic tyranny, a nightmare orchestrated by beings who held absolute power and wielded it with the emotional maturity of toddlers. Can you believe that the supreme ruler of the cosmos, the mighty Zeus, spent more time disguised as livestock to commit unspeakable acts than he did actually running the world? That is the terrifying reality we face. The Olympians were not guardians. They were glorious, terrifying monsters, masters of manipulation who treated humanity as nothing more than disposable pawns in their eternal, incestuous power games. This entire, beautiful, tragic story begins with a catastrophic event no one saw coming, the moment the Titans fell. Not because the Olympians were inherently better, but because they were simply more ruthless, more calculating, and far more willing to cheat. Zeus, the supposed savior, the hero who freed his siblings, was in reality the most dangerous entity the ancient world had ever produced. He was the ultimate alpha predator, capable of shifting shape, commanding the elements, and delivering absolute judgment, yet fundamentally driven by paranoia and insatiable lust. Imagine a being with the power to vaporize mountains, whose mere bad mood could trigger a global flood, and whose primary daily concern was figuring out how to sneak past his own wife to seduce a river nymph or a mortal princess. And Hera, the supposed queen of heaven, she was the wronged wife, yes, but her fury was not righteous. It was annihilating, a calculated weapon she aimed not at the cheating king, but at the innocent mortals he had momentarily glanced at. Her jealousy was legendary, a disease that infected Olympus and created a constant atmosphere of terror. If Zeus slept with you, your life was over. And if you were lucky, you'd only be turned into a cow. If you truly understand the Olympian structure, you realize it was a cycle of abuse inherited directly from the previous generations. They ate their children, they overthrew their fathers, and they institutionalized violence as a form of divine authority. Poseidon, the earth-shaker, was perhaps the most volatile of the brothers, a god whose temper tantrums manifested as tsunamis and earthquakes, shattering entire civilizations merely because he felt slighted in a minor competition with Athena. He wasn't governing the seas. He was drowning anyone who irritated him, demanding human sacrifice to appease his boundless ego, proving that beneath the shining trident was pure, unbridled rage. And Hades, the one they banished to the underworld? He wasn't the devil. He was the quiet, terrifying bureaucrat of death, operating a massive infrastructure dedicated to processing the endless line of victims generated by the carelessness of his family above. The Olympians were a living contradiction. They were eternal, yet they acted purely on transient, petty emotions. They were omnipotent, yet incapable of resisting the most base desires, leading to decisions that destroyed entire families and reshaped the landscape forever. They were the definition of power, corrupting absolutely. A terrifying confirmation that having infinite strength does not equate to having infinite wisdom. We have been conditioned to see their stories as colorful myths, charming tales of heroism. But tonight, we realize that every single story we love is actually a court transcript detailing a violent felony. The Trojan War? That was nothing more than a dispute over a beauty contest, escalated by the vanity of three goddesses, Hera, Athena, and Aphrodite, who demanded Zeus choose the prettiest, leading to a 10-year slaughter. Can you believe the fate of thousands of soldiers and the destruction of a magnificent city hinged entirely on the hurt feelings and massive egos of divine beings who should have known better? Get ready, because the true history of Mount Olympus is about to be revealed, and it is far more horrifying than any monster myth you have ever heard. This is the story of how the greatest golden age was actually a gilded cage, and the gods were the guards. The war was a decade of unimaginable elemental chaos, where mountains were hurled like pebbles and the oceans boiled, all to secure the new, far more ruthless management team on Olympus. And what became of the defeated? The myths speak of banishment, but Zeus invented the concept of eternal, customized incarceration, Tartarus. Imagine a cosmic prison so profoundly deep that a bronze anvil dropped from the Earth's surface would fall for 9 full days and nights before even reaching its gates. It is a place beyond light, beyond time, a realm of absolute sensory deprivation and permanent madness, guarded not by kindly jailers, but by the monstrous Hecatonchires, 50 heads and 100 crushing arms, pure, terrifying enforcement. This wasn't merely a dungeon for the former rulers. It was a permanent, visceral warning etched into the very foundations of the universe. Cross the new king, and you will not simply die. You will be erased and trapped in eternal, conscious horror. Zeus, the self-proclaimed king of the gods, was instantly consumed by the very paranoia he had inherited and amplified. His entire reign became a suffocating feedback loop of maintaining power, requiring constant surveillance and instant, disproportionate retribution against any perceived slight. He demanded absolute fealty from his siblings and children, yet he trusted precisely none of them, knowing they harbored the same lethal ambition that had propelled him to the summit. His weapon, the lightning bolt, was not a symbol of justice or divine wisdom. It was the ultimate instrument of terror, capable of incinerating anything, god, nymph, giant, or mortal, that dared challenge the divine monopoly on authority. It was the cosmic equivalent of a nuclear deterrent, aimed solely at enforcing silence. Look closely at the Olympus boardroom, the inner circle of the gilded cage. It was the most dysfunctional, violently jealous, and power-hungry family unit ever assembled. Hera, the queen, was not the noble guardian of marriage, but a cosmic warden obsessed with punishing every single transgression of her philandering husband, displaying a terrifying jealous rage that almost exclusively targeted the innocent victims of Zeus's lust, not the perpetrator himself. Her fury served as a secondary mechanism of divine control. While Zeus terrified the powerful into submission, Hera ensured the weak and vulnerable, the mortal women, the nymphs, the illegitimate children, never found lasting peace or security, enforcing the cruelty of the system from within the family structure. Even Zeus's brothers were relegated to realms of necessary brutality. Poseidon, the master of the seas, was a moody, temperamental brute whose ego was easily bruised, capable of unleashing catastrophic earthquakes and tsunamis on entire civilizations simply because he felt slighted by a single coastal town's poor offering or a slight to his aquatic prestige. He ruled by chaotic destruction, an unpredictable, terrifying force of nature harnessed specifically to the Olympian regime's whims, proving that stability was an illusion easily shattered. Hades, the silent partner, was effectively relegated to running the cosmic sewage system and prison complex, the underworld. While perhaps the least volatile of the three brothers, his domain ensured that even death offered no escape from the Olympian territorial claims, trapping souls in an endless, often miserable, bureaucratic afterlife subject to the whims of the dead king. So, what did this tyrannical regime mean for the mortals living in the supposed Golden Age? It meant peace bought at the crushing cost of total autonomy and perpetual ignorance. Mortals were not partners in creation. They were glorified pets, subjects of divine experimentation, and most importantly, endless sources of entertainment and praise. Their lives were meticulously monitored, their advancements limited, and their suffering often the direct result of an Olympian's petty argument over a tribute, a slight to their vanity, or a passing, predatory fancy. If a mortal achieved too much, challenged a god's artistic skill, boasted of their own talents, or possessed a beauty that drew Zeus's predatory, inescapable gaze, their fate was sealed with instant transformation, eternal torment, or painful, irreversible death. The gods did not descend from Olympus on thrones of cloud to dispense wisdom. They were observing their creation like laboratory scientists watching mice in a maze, ready to introduce a catastrophic variable, a sudden deluge, a plague, or a monster, if the experiment proved boring, disobedient, or overly ambitious. The true horror lies not in the mythical beasts they vanquished, but in the casual, structural cruelty they inflicted upon the innocent merely because they could. And there is one particular story, a tale of a brilliant architect, a cursed island, and a monstrous birth, that perfectly encapsulates the terrifying reality of living under the thumb of the Olympian tyrants. The stench of rotting fear hung thick over the island of Crete, a terror so absolute it eclipsed the Mediterranean sun. You think the Minotaur was just a mythological beast, a sad consequence of a queen's misplaced lust? That is the gentle lie they sold the ages, the diluted truth meant to preserve the thin, shimmering facade of Mount Olympus. The truth, the seismic, skull-shattering reality, is that the Minotaur was a weapon, forged in the furnace of divine spite, an eternal, screaming testament to the brutal pettiness of the Olympian regime. King Minos, the self-proclaimed servant of the gods, believed he could play a small, insignificant trick on Poseidon, the earth-shaker, the storm-bringer who held the deep abyss in his hand. Minos needed a sign of his legitimate rule, so he prayed for a magnificent bull to sacrifice, promising to return it to the sea god's altar. Poseidon, always eager to indulge a mortal's ego just before crushing it, delivered the creature, a perfect, snow-white beast of unimaginable majesty and power. But Minos, blinded by avarice, decided the bull was too glorious to kill. He substituted a lesser animal, believing the volatile, easily distracted sea god wouldn't notice. This single act of mortal hubris, this tiny betrayal of a cosmic favor, was seized upon by Poseidon not as an inconvenience, but as an opportunity for the kind of cold, creative cruelty only an Olympian could conceive. Poseidon did not strike Minos down with a tidal wave. He didn't shatter the palace with an earthquake. That would be too quick, too merciful. No, the gods prefer psychological torment, a curse that infects the bloodline and destroys the very concept of peace from the inside out. His revenge was tailored, intimate, and designed to spread existential dread across the entire mortal world. He inflicted an unnatural, maddening desire upon Minos' wife, Queen Pasiphae. Imagine the scene. A queen, driven utterly insane by a sudden, consuming, inescapable lust for the very bull her husband had stolen from the god. This was not romance. This was biological warfare waged by a divine mind. Pasiphae became a vessel for divine vengeance, her dignity stripped, her sanity dissolved into a terrifying animalistic obsession. Even the craftsman Daedalus, the brilliant engineer, was forced into complicity, building the infamous hollow wooden cow that allowed the monstrous coupling to occur. It was Hephaestus's handiwork, the fire god, the supreme artisan, designing a mechanical prop for the ultimate divine humiliation. Think about that collaboration. The Olympian gods, supposedly concerned with order and justice, actively pooling their prodigious talents to facilitate bestiality and breed a horror. They were bored, cruel, and obsessed with demonstrating the sheer, terrifying limits of their power over the human body and mind. The resulting creature was the Minotaur, the bull of Minos, half man, half beast, trapped forever between two worlds, a physical embodiment of divine displeasure. He was a creature of ravenous hunger and unending confusion, locked away not in a mere prison, but in the labyrinth, the ultimate architectural metaphor for mortal hopelessness. The labyrinth, also designed by Daedalus under duress, was more than just a maze. It was a perfect, inescapable holding cell, a torture chamber built into the very foundation of civilization. And why was this creature allowed to live? Why not simply destroy it? Because the Minotaur served a purpose far grander than mere punishment of Minos. It was the ultimate propaganda tool for the entire Olympian regime. Every year, Athens, a city that dared to occasionally challenge Cretan and thus divine authority, was forced to send a tribute of 7 young men and 7 young women into that twisting darkness. The Olympians didn't just tolerate this blood tax, they reveled in it. They watched the procession of weeping families, the terror in the eyes of the young tributes, the desperation of the monarchs. This was their entertainment, their affirmation of status. Zeus and Poseidon, competitive tyrants that they were, understood that true power wasn't just in throwing lightning bolts. It was in maintaining a constant, low-frequency hum of dread that permeated mortal existence. The Minotaur was a living, breathing symbol of the fact that the Olympians viewed humanity not as worshippers, but as livestock, to be bred, controlled, and culled as necessary to maintain the cosmic balance, a balance defined entirely by their own fragile egos. They loved their monsters because the monsters did the dirty work of tyranny, spreading fear efficiently without the gods having to lift a finger. Imagine the gods gathered on Olympus, leaning back on their clouds, sipping nectar, and observing the labyrinth's annual harvest of fear. They saw not a tragedy, but a well-oiled machine of control. The suffering was deliberate, the fear was the fertilizer for their worship, and the monster was just a very effective, albeit grotesque, messenger. And the true twist? The very notion of a hero, of Theseus, the brave champion who slayed the Minotaur, was only permissible because the gods allowed it. Sometimes the show needs an intermission, a carefully scripted moment of hope to make the next wave of despair even more potent. Divine intervention wasn't about justice, it was about production value. They needed the mortals to believe that escape was possible, even when it wasn't probable, keeping them forever locked in the psychological prison of hope and fear. This entire episode, the bull, the queen, the monster, the maze, the sacrifice, was a perfectly executed piece of terror theater, designed to reinforce the central tenet of the Olympian regime: submit or face a punishment that transcends death, a curse that will eat your future children. The story of the Minotaur is the story of Poseidon's insecurity, Minos's stupidity, and the terrifying, casual cruelty of an immortal elite who used mortal suffering as a foundation for their eternal, glittering, and utterly heartless throne. They didn't rule with wisdom. They ruled with carefully cultivated, monstrous dread and unforgettable fear. That dread, that suffocating terror we just described, wasn't just a byproduct of their rule, it was the primary product. Olympus was less a seat of government and more a maximum security observation deck where the gods watched their subjects squirm, waiting for the smallest infraction. They had perfected the art of cosmic surveillance, their all-seeing eyes not searching for virtue, but for weakness that could be exploited for sport. Their entire existence was predicated on the understanding that if mortals ever stopped being afraid, if they ever looked up and saw the gods were just powerful, narcissistic children, the whole facade would crumble into dust. Therefore, fear had to be weaponized, formalized, and dispensed with absolute precision, and Zeus had appointed his own personal, divine enforcers to run the terror network. The chief of this brutal security detail, the one who truly embodied the Olympian spirit of pure, unadulterated violence, was the war god Ares. Forget the strategic general of modern myth. This Ares was a raging psychopath whose very breath smelled of blood and burning cities. Ares didn't care about victory or defeat. He only cared about the glorious, messy process of slaughter. He was the god of pure, red-hot murder, a walking, screaming engine of destruction that Zeus could point at any rising civilization or rebellious tribe to instantly extinguish the flame of hope. He was the living proof that power corrupts absolutely, a constant, visceral threat to both mortals and lesser gods alike. The moment Zeus needed to remind everyone that consequences were not abstract, Ares would descend, riding chariots pulled by fear and terror itself, tearing the fabric of mortal existence apart just for the sheer electric thrill of it. His violence wasn't strategic. It was therapeutic for him. Every scream was a symphony, every broken shield a testament to his unstoppable primal force, ensuring that the ground remained perpetually soaked in the fear necessary to sustain the high life on Mount Olympus. But terror requires more than just brute force. It requires infrastructure. And here we must turn our attention to the misunderstood architect of divine tyranny, Hephaestus. The lame, often ridiculed god of the forge was actually the ultimate weapons manufacturer, the silent genius behind every gilded cage and indestructible shackle. His furnaces didn't just churn out pretty jewelry for Aphrodite. They forged the chains that bound Prometheus, the automated defenses that sealed Olympus, and the complex, inescapable traps set for any mortal foolish enough to try and outsmart the gods. He was the ultimate compliance officer, using his mechanical brilliance to ensure divine superiority was technologically unassailable. Hephaestus was the reason that even the strongest heroes knew, deep down, that challenging Olympus was physically impossible, because his craftsmanship was literally divine and brutally effective. If Ares was the sledgehammer and Hephaestus the lock, then the twins, Apollo and Artemis, were the precision scalpels of Olympian cruelty, demonstrating that malice could be perfectly choreographed and strikingly beautiful. Apollo, the god of light, music, and prophecy, was also the god of sudden, devastating plague, and the arrow that never missed its mark. He could bestow the gift of prophecy, only to use that knowledge to set up an inevitable, soul-crushing tragedy, making the victim aware of their doom long before it arrived. His light wasn't illumination, it was inspection, shining into every dark corner of the mortal soul only to judge it wanting and worthy of swift, often disease-ridden execution. This wasn't punishment. It was a psychological operation. It was a message delivered with terrifying clarity to every mortal. Do not look. Do not question. Do not even accidentally see us as anything less than perfect, terrifying rulers, or your dearest companions will be the agents of your agonizing demise. These horrific acts, Eris's unending carnage, Hephaestus's perfect traps, the twins' cold, targeted exterminations, were not random outbursts. They were calculated instruments of state control, ensuring that the high-security prison disguised as the Golden Age remained perpetually locked. Every god, no matter how specialized, was ultimately a loyal, often terrified agent of Zeus's Machiavellian agent. They knew that defying the head tyrant meant facing the combined force of the entire, pathologically unstable family. And no one, not even a god, truly wanted to experience the full, unadulterated wrath of Olympus. They lived in a golden cage of their own making, fueled by the misery they inflicted, perpetually paranoid, eternally jealous, and locked into a cycle of self-aggrandizing cruelty that promised to eventually consume the world they claimed to protect. This was the terrifying, true nature of the Olympian regime: absolute power wielded by absolute monsters. We left off understanding that Olympus was a fortress built on fear. But the true horror wasn't just the king's lightning bolt tantrums. It was the entire court, the sprawling bureaucracy of divine terror that enforced Zeus's chaotic whims across the cosmos and throughout eternity. These weren't benevolent rulers who occasionally erred. They were cosmic wardens, each specializing in a unique flavor of despair, ensuring that no mortal or lesser deity dared step out of line, ever. The very notion of a divine order was simply a euphemism for a perfectly engineered system of perpetual surveillance and existential threat, woven into the fabric of reality itself. Forget the charming myths of divine stewardship. The Olympians operated a machine of control so insidious that even hope was rationed, carefully delivered only when necessary to prevent mass rebellion, a temporary balm before the next cycle of crushing terror began anew. Their immortality meant their cruelty was not a phase, but an institutional certainty, a terrifying guarantee that their tyranny would never end, not in 1,000 years, not in 10,000. Zeus allowed Ares his horrific bloodlust because it served a crucial purpose, generating sufficient mortal terror to remind everyone just how fragile their existence truly was, keeping them desperate, distracted, and eternally compliant, too busy fighting their neighbors to look up and question the throne on Mount Olympus. Ares was the ultimate tool of population control, a self-perpetuating generator of tragedy designed to keep humanity small and easily managed, ensuring they never amassed enough stable civilization to challenge the divine status quo. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this entire, eternal regime was the quiet authority of Hades, the lord of the underworld. He wasn't some brooding, misunderstood loner reluctantly managing the dead. He was the warden of the eternal prison, the keeper of the ultimate, non-negotiable consequence, ensuring that even death offered absolutely no escape from the Olympian jurisdiction. Every single soul, no matter how noble or defiant in life, ultimately filtered through his cold, inescapable domain, where resistance ended not just in death, but in perpetual servitude endless punishment, or the soul-crushing boredom of permanent gray existence beneath the earth. His silent, absolute authority was the steel foundation upon which Zeus's theatrical lightning bolts rested, the chilling promise that once they had you, they held you forever, body or soul. And then there was the psychological operation run by Olympus, which was just as brutal as the physical violence wielded by Ares and his ilk. Take Apollo, the supposed god of light, music, and prophecy. He wasn't merely a lyre player singing pretty songs. He was the orchestrator of divine propaganda, controlling the flow of information and manufacturing the oracles that kept kings, generals, and entire empires marching precisely where Zeus needed them to go, convinced they were following destiny. His radiant light masked a cold, calculated manipulation designed to ensure mortals never questioned the divine plan, turning the very idea of enlightenment into a tool for compliance, subtly redirecting all mortal creativity and energy toward their own subjugation. Apollo's prophecies were rarely glimpses of the future. They were self-fulfilling directives, designed to eliminate potential threats before they even knew they existed, ensuring mortal agency was nothing more than a carefully stage-managed illusion. And the most terrifying manipulator of all? Athena. Often lauded as the paragon of strategic thinking and civilization, the true Athena was the ultimate Machiavellian political operator, the one who drafted the celestial laws and found the flawless logical loopholes to justify every act of divine atrocity and mass slaughter. Her wisdom wasn't aimed at mortal enlightenment or true justice. It was about efficiency in domination, calculating the precise amount of suffering required to maintain perfect long-term stability. She ensured that mortal innovation never progressed far enough to truly challenge Olympus itself, always keeping humanity one step short of genuine self-reliance, perpetually dependent on her strategic guidance. She engineered the wars that crippled rising city-states and fostered the internal divisions that kept mortals weak, all while maintaining the veneer of the wise, protective goddess. This wasn't a family of divine protectors. It was a cartel of eternal, self-interested beings who viewed the entire universe as a resource to be harvested for their fleeting pleasure and everlasting power. Every storm, every harvest, every prophecy was filtered through the lens of maximizing their own comfort and minimizing the threat of mortal independence, consuming the world while claiming to protect it. They weren't just bad, they were the ultimate, immortal parasites, feeding off the fear, the devotion, and the tragedy of the mortal realm, all while maintaining the monstrous lie of the noble Olympian Golden Age. The terrifying realization that must hit you like a thunderbolt is this: they didn't just rule the world, they actively designed it, its limits, its rules, its pain, to be a perfectly tailored torture chamber specifically for their eternal entertainment and absolute security. An architecture of celestial dread that defined every breath taken on Earth. We left off staring into the abyss of the Golden Age, realizing it was a perfect, tailored prison, an architecture of celestial dread. But who keeps the warden's wife in line? Who dares to question the Queen of Heaven, whose jealousy was not just a tantrum, but a governing principle of the universe. Hera. The name sounds regal, sounds protective. But forget the soft, domestic image painted by later, sanitized histories. Hera was the ultimate security system for Zeus's tyranny, not because she helped him rule, but because her unpredictable volcanic rage made every single living thing, mortal and immortal alike, walk on shattered glass. She was the chaos factor, the walking nightmare that kept everyone perpetually off balance. Zeus might have wielded the thunderbolt, the blunt instrument of cosmic correction, but Hera? She wielded psychological warfare, slow-burn vengeance, and the terrifying knowledge that if you crossed her, your lineage, your descendants, and even the very land you walked upon would suffer for generations. Her rage was generational debt, payable in blood and madness. Imagine being a mortal favored by Zeus, or worse, noticed by him. That favor was not a blessing. It was a death warrant, signed by Hera, sealed with creeping madness. She didn't often kill directly. That was too quick, too merciful. She preferred to dismantle, to unravel the victim's reality thread by agonizing thread, turning their blessings into catastrophic curses. Look at Io, a beautiful priestess, snared by Zeus's lust. When Hera found out, did she strike Zeus? Of course not. She struck the victim. Io was transformed into a pure white heifer, constantly running, constantly tormented, chased across the continents by a stinging gadfly, a tiny, agonizing instrument of Hera's relentless cosmic scorn. And why the gadfly? Because Hera understood that true suffering is monotony paired with inescapable pain. The constant buzz, the constant sting, day and night, world without end, turning a vast, beautiful earth into a claustrophobic cage. This wasn't justice, this was artistry and cruelty, a masterclass in making life unlivable while technically keeping the victim alive. This pattern repeated infinitely. Semele, mother of Dionysus, convinced by Hera in disguise and whispering venom to ask Zeus to reveal his true form, a request seemingly innocent, yet fatal. Hera knew the mortal body could not withstand the unshielded power of the king of the cosmos. Semele was incinerated in a blast of pure, atomic divinity, a consequence designed not just to eliminate a rival, but to send a chilling, unmistakable message to the entire cosmos. Interfere with my marriage, and you burn. But Hera's reach extended far beyond Zeus's conquests. She hated heroes, those mortals who dared to achieve greatness, because greatness implied a challenge to divine exclusivity. If mortals could achieve epic feats, perhaps they didn't need the gods. This was a direct threat to the celestial power structure itself. Enter Heracles, the greatest hero of the Greek world, a symbol of mortal potential, and Hera's greatest victim. From the moment he was born, she sought his destruction. Not just petty attempts, but grand, sweeping campaigns of destruction aimed at making his entire life a horrific gauntlet. Hera didn't need to lift a finger to kill him. She simply needed to whisper the right frequency of madness into his soul, turning the strongest man on earth into the architect of his own familial annihilation. The labors of Heracles? They weren't glorious tasks of heroism. They were Hera's attempts at forced suicide, a penitentiary sentence designed to exhaust him into oblivion. The Nemean lion, the Lernaean hydra, the stables of Augeas. Each task was a death sentence manufactured by a jealous deity who could not tolerate the sight of human excellence. This wasn't mythology. It was the chilling documentation of a totalitarian regime using targeted psychological destruction to maintain the caste system between gods and men. And what about the other Olympians? They watched. They knew. But they were too terrified to intervene. Hera was the ultimate litmus test for loyalty to the regime. If you protected her victims, you became her next target. If you condemned her cruelty, you were questioning the very foundation of the divine order. Poseidon, the earth shaker, might grumble, but he rarely acted against her direct commands. Hades, sealed deep in the underworld, maintained a fearful distance. Even Eris, the savage god of war, often found himself manipulated by his mother's deeper, colder, more calculating cruelty. They all understood the unspoken rule of Olympus. Zeus rules by power, but Hera rules by fear, by the constant, grinding dread of unpredictable, personalized horror. She was the enforcer of the cosmic pecking order, ensuring that no mortal dared to rise too high, nor did any minor deity forget their place. Her domain was not just marriage, it was the preservation of absolute, unchallenged divine supremacy through the calculated distribution of terror and suffering. The gods did not rule because they were wise. They ruled because they were the most brutally efficient administrators of pain the universe had ever known. And Hera was the undisputed master of that agonizing craft. We must now turn our gaze from the Queen of Heaven to the God of the Sea, who ruled the churning depths and held the tectonic plates in his volatile, vengeful hands, proving that the Olympian family pathology ran far deeper than just Zeus and his toxic queen. The true terror lay in the fact that every single one of them was a monster, just specializing in a different form of catastrophe. Poseidon was next on the agenda, ready to prove that stability was merely a temporary illusion maintained by a narcissistic, waterlogged tyrant. His rage wasn't sexual jealousy like Hera's, but pure, unadulterated territorial spite, ready to swallow continents whole if his ego was slightly bruised. This was the architecture of celestial dread, a systemic, multifaceted terror network where every Olympian held a portfolio of pain, ensuring no mortal could ever truly find peace or escape the eternal, vengeful scrutiny of their divine overlords. You think the gods simply ruled? No. They outsourced the suffering. The Olympian hierarchy was not a noble council dedicated to cosmic balance. It was a corporate structure of specialized cruelty, a terrifying syndicate where every divine portfolio, from the ocean to the grain harvest, was a specialized, meticulously crafted weapon aimed directly at the soft underbelly of mankind. They didn't just govern life. They manipulated the essential conditions necessary for life, making absolute constant compliance the only way to temporarily delay the inevitable, excruciating destruction that awaited anyone who dared cross them or even slightly inconvenience their divine masters. The official history, the sanitized myth peddled by ancient poets on the Olympians' payroll, paints Poseidon as the grumpy but ultimately necessary ruler of the seas. That is the whitewashed lie they desperately want you to internalize, to accept as the cost of civilization. The terrifying, unvarnished truth is that Poseidon was the ultimate instrument of economic destabilization and mass panic, a waterlogged anarchist given infinite, untrammeled power, whose primary function was to remind mortals that their commerce, their food supply, and their very coastal existence was conditional, moment by unpredictable moment. Every shipment lost beneath the waves, every coastal city swallowed by the sudden, churning tsunami, every tremor that instantly crumbled the carefully stacked foundations of mortal existence, that was Poseidon flexing his muscle, not in defense of his domain, but in calculated, whimsical, and utterly pitiless malice. He wasn't guarding the deep. He was holding the world's entire trade network hostage, demanding constant, lavish appeasement and sacrifice, simply to allow a fragile wooden ship to cross a patch of water he considered his personal bathtub and temporary playground. Remember the ancient story of the walls of Troy? Poseidon, slighted by a local king's failure to pay him the proper tribute for construction work, didn't just get mad and throw a tantrum. He became the deliberate, masterful architect of their doom, unleashing the legendary sea monster that demanded human sacrifice, and later, perhaps even orchestrating the monstrous storm that devastated the returning Greek fleet after the war had been won, simply because he was bored, felt disrespected, and had a sudden urge to demonstrate the brutal, non-negotiable limits of mortal ambition. He enforced the doctrine that the sea was not a resource to be used, but a boundary to be feared, ensuring that humanity remained geographically fractured and incapable of uniting against the Olympian threat, always preoccupied with rebuilding shattered docks or burying drowned kin. But if Zeus controlled the sky above and Poseidon the earth and sea below, who managed the chilling finality? Who controlled the ultimate, non-negotiable, and inescapable end to mortal defiance? That portfolio belonged to Hades, the silent, terrifying CEO of the underworld, the literal, unavoidable tax collector of life, whose domain represented the most permanent form of Olympian jurisdiction. Hades is rarely portrayed as a sexually aggressive rapist or a petty, jealous tyrant like his infamous brothers. And that clinical detachment is, ironically, his most effective and insidious piece of psychological propaganda. His cruelty was colder, more bureaucratic, more absolute, and absolutely, terrifyingly guaranteed. He didn't need to throw lightning bolts because he held the ultimate, undeniable leverage, the chilling fact that everything ends here, and even the act of dying placed you directly back under the iron fist of the Olympian regime, ensuring no true escape was possible. The underworld was not a restful afterlife or a place of neutral judgment. It was a cosmic holding cell designed to ensure that even in death, no soul could truly escape the Olympian surveillance and punitive jurisdiction. Every shade that passed through the desolate gates was categorized, judged, and immediately sentenced to an eternity of whatever customized misery the gods deemed appropriate for their level of disrespect or disobedience shown during their brief, fleeting, and ultimately monitored time on Earth. Think deeply about the horrifying myths of Sisyphus or Tantalus. These were never intended to be simple lessons in morality or consequence. They were state-sponsored, high-visibility torture demonstrations, broadcast back into the mortal world as terrifying, undeniable warnings. This is precisely what happens when you try to outsmart, evade, or merely inconvenient us. They weaponized eternity itself, turning hope into an endless, agonizing cycle of failed attempts and perpetual thirst, guaranteeing that the psychological terror of divine retribution stretched far beyond the limit of the mortal lifespan. And while the Big Three managed the mega disasters and the ultimate, inescapable fate, other specialized gods handled the day-to-day enforcement and the brutalization of daily life. Ares ensured that war was not just an occasional, unfortunate, or necessary evil, but a constant, self-perpetuating, and profitable cycle of horror, feeding incessantly off mortal fear, pride, and petty ambition. His presence guaranteed that even the most trivial, localized dispute could instantly escalate into unimaginable savagery, solely because the vast Olympian syndicate required a steady, dependable supply of fresh, terrified souls and shattered civilizations for Hades' quotas and Zeus's entertainment. This intricate, interlocking network of terror, Zeus controlling the fate and law, Poseidon managing the catastrophic environmental blackmail, Hades processing the final destination, and Ares providing the constant, violent mechanism of destruction, shows the true, chilling face of the so-called Golden Age. It wasn't about divine wisdom, nobility, or guardianship. It was a masterclass in total population control, enforced by the most powerful, psychopathic family in existence.